The stale air in my workshop always felt thick, a tangible weight of dust motes dancing in the single beam of my desk lamp. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent tune, a symphony of sirens and distant traffic that I'd learned to tune out. My hands, usually steady, traced the cool, worn metal of a disassembled microscope. It was a relic, much like myself, gathering dust in the forgotten corners of a life I'd deliberately dismantled. I'd traded the sterile chill of the lab for the comforting grime of old electronics and the satisfying click of a well-oiled gear. My days were a quiet rhythm of repair and salvage, a far cry from the high-stakes dance with death I'd once known. The satisfaction was different, cleaner. No ghosts lingered in the tangled wires of a vintage radio, no whispers of what could have been. A sharp rap on my door, louder than any city sound, jolted me. My jaw tightened. Visitors were rare, unwelcome intrusions into my carefully constructed solitude. I set down the microscope, wiping my hands on my oil-stained apron. "Yeah," I called out, my voice rough from disuse. The door creaked open, revealing a uniformed officer. He looked young, a bit out of his depth, clutching a tablet like it was a shield. He scanned the organized chaos of my workshop shelves crammed with components, workbenches laden with tools, the faint metallic tang of solder. "UserXG?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, leaning against my workbench. "That's me. What can I do for officer?" I kept my tone neutral, a practiced shield against the world. He shuffled his feet. We received a request for my particular expertise." He glanced at the tablet, then back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "It's about a situation, down at the precinct." My stomach gave a small, unwelcome clench. "My expertise is in restoring vintage technology, officer, not precinct situations. They said I have a background in forensics." His question hung in the air, laced with an unspoken judgment I'd grown accustomed to. I pushed off the workbench, my movements deliberate. "That was a long time ago, and I'm retired." They're calling it the Origami Killer," he blurted out, his gaze fixed on the floor. "The staging, it's intricate, very precise, reminds them of something." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. The words hit me like a physical blow. Origami, precision, reminds them. My knuckles brushed against the cool metal of a discarded circuit board, the familiar texture doing little to ground me. My breath hitched, a silent gasp in the quiet workshop. "They want to see the officer continued, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Chief Inspector wants there, urgently." I looked at him, this uniformed stranger, and saw not just an officer but a messenger from a past I'd tried so hard to bury. It was a language I knew all too well, a language I'd sworn never to speak again. "The basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker," he replied, reciting the address with an almost rehearsed weariness. "It's not a pleasant scene." The words were a grim confirmation. The basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker. The smell of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final. A place where the worst of humanity was laid bare, dissected, and catalogued. A place I knew intimately, a place that held the echoes of my greatest failures. I stood there for a long moment, the hum of the city outside fading into a distant drone. The dust motes in my workshop seemed to swirl with renewed energy, like tiny specters of memory. My hands, still bearing the faint scent of oil and solder, clenched into fists. "All right, officer," I said, my voice finding a new, hard edge. "Take me there." As I followed him out, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping back into a nightmare I'd barely escaped. The Origami Killer. The name itself was a taunt, a cruel reminder of a puzzle I'd once believed I'd solved, only to discover it was merely a piece of a much larger, far more terrifying picture. And now, it seemed, that picture was being painted again. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker, was thick with the metallic tang of decay, a scent I knew too well. It clung to everything, a second skin that settled into my pores. The flickering tubes overhead cast a sickly, oscillating light, making the pale forms on the stainless steel tables seem even more spectral. Each drip from the unseen pipes above echoed in the cavernous space, a rhythmic, unsettling metronome counting down to what? I didn't want to know. A figure in a crisp, dark suit stood by the nearest table, his back to me. He didn't turn as I approached, his silence more imposing than any greeting. I recognized him, of course. The chief. He was the reason I was here, the man who dragged me from my self-imposed exile. UserXG, he said, his voice low, devoid of warmth. It was the same voice that had delivered the news of my downfall years ago. Now it was a summons. I stopped a few feet away, my gaze drawn to the sheet draped over the body. I didn't need to see, I could feel it, the meticulous arrangement, the disturbing artistry. "You're wasting my time," I said, my own voice rougher than I intended. It had been a long time since I'd spoken in a place like this. He finally turned, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. His eyes, however, held a sharp, unwavering focus. "This is why I called you. This is why you're here." He gestured to the body. Victim is a city councilman. He was found this morning in his study. No sign of forced entry, nothing obviously disturbed except. He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the damp air. I walked closer, my boots making soft thuds on the tiled floor. The chief pulled back the sheet. My breath hitched. It was there. The signature. A small, impossibly intricate origami crane fashioned from a sliver of the victim's own skin placed precisely on his chest. This couldn't be. I'd buried this. I'd buried him, the Origami Killer. "You recognize it," the chief stated, not a question. "Same M.O., different victims, but the signature. It's identical. The police are baffled. They're calling it a copycat, but..." He didn't need to finish. I knew this wasn't a copycat. It was too perfect. Too familiar. My mind raced, a frantic carousel of memories I tried so hard to lock away. The painstaking reconstruction of the crime scenes, the dead ends, the gnawing certainty that I was missing something crucial. And then the abrupt, brutal end. The case had been closed, the killer apprehended, or so they'd said. The last time I began, my voice gaining a brittle edge, the killer was caught, they confessed. The chief gave a short, humorless laugh. Did they? Or was that just what made the paperwork easier? He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "This is beyond anything our current team can handle, UserXG. This is my territory, my specialization. My specialization." The shame of it still burned, a dull ember beneath the surface. I looked at the origami crane again. The skin was stretched taut, almost translucent under the harsh light. The folds were impossibly sharp, betraying a steady hand and a terrifying focus. It was a work of art, a macabre masterpiece, and it was a message. Who were the other victims? I asked, my eyes scanning the room, the sterile efficiency of the morgue a stark contrast to the chaos I felt churning inside. A librarian 2 weeks ago, a retired teacher last week. No obvious connections between them or to this councilman, just them and the cranes. The chief watched me, his expression unreadable. He knew the weight of this. He knew what this meant for me. I, the scientist in me, the part that craved order and truth, was already stirring. The lure of the puzzle, the undeniable pull of the unknown, was a powerful current. "You can, UserXG," the chief said softly, his gaze piercing. "You have to, because whatever you thought you solved back then, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning." My gaze drifted to the pipes, their steady drip a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm now pounding in my chest. I was back, and the Origami Killer, it seemed, had never truly left. I felt a strange, unwelcome surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to engage with the threat. This was more than just a case. It was a personal reckoning. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was thick with a scent I knew too well, a cloying mix of disinfectant and something far more primal, something that settled deep in the back of my throat. It was the smell of finality, of stories abruptly ended. My own story, it seemed, was far from over. The flickering lights, a nauseating strobe effect, did little to ease the knot tightening in my gut. Each stutter of illumination felt like a jolt, a reminder of the years I'd spent trying to outrun this place, this life. I pushed open the heavy metal door, the screech echoing in the oppressive quiet. A uniformed officer, his face a mask of bored indifference, stood by a portable barrier. He barely glanced at my credentials, a dismissive wave of his hand indicating I could pass. "Detectives in charge," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall behind me. Detective. The title felt like a phantom limb, a part of me I'd lost and never expected to feel again. Inside, the scene was a tableau of sterile chaos. Technicians in blue booties and gloves moved with practiced efficiency, their hushed conversations a low hum. The body, covered by a stark white sheet, lay on a stainless steel slab. It was the third one in as many weeks, the same meticulous staging, the same signature, the origamist. I approached the slab, my boots making soft thuds on the linoleum. The detective, a burly man with tired eyes and a permanent frown etched into his brow, was already there, talking to a younger officer. He turned as I neared, his frown deepening. "UserXG," he stated, not a question. His voice was gravelly, like he'd swallowed a fistful of sand. "Didn't expect to see you crawling back." I ignored the barb, my focus already on the details. The victim was a man, middle-aged, dressed in a suit that was remarkably unwrinkled for someone who'd apparently met such a violent end. The staging was, as always, unnervingly precise. A single, perfectly folded paper crane sat on his chest, nestled just above the sternum. "The preliminary report is on its way," the detective said, his tone laced with impatience. "We've got what we need. This isn't your jurisdiction anymore." "It's never not my jurisdiction when he's involved," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor I felt inside. I crouched, my eyes scanning the area around the slab. The official team had been thorough, I'd give them that. Everything was bagged, tagged, or swabbed. But they were looking for the obvious. I was looking for the whispers. The detective scoffed. "You still chasing ghosts, UserXG? This is a professional job, clean, no forced entry, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "That's the point, isn't it?" I murmured, my gaze snagging on a faint scuff mark near the drainage grate. It was almost imperceptible, easily missed. But it was there, too precise for accidental contact. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they wanted us to know it. I pulled out a small, high-intensity penlight from my jacket pocket, its beam cutting through the ambient gloom. I swept it across the floor, the light catching on dust motes dancing in the air. The scuff mark was made by something smooth, something that had been dragged. Not a shoe, not a piece of equipment. "You're wasting our time," the detective said, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. "This isn't just about this victim," I countered, standing up, my knees protesting slightly. "It's about the pattern, the precision, the signature." I gestured to the paper crane. "He always leaves a calling card, always the origami, but why?" The younger officer, who had been silently observing, piped up. "To taunt us, to make us look for him." "Maybe," I conceded, turning my attention back to the slab. The sheet was taut, suggesting the body hadn't been disturbed post-mortem. Or maybe it's a message, a way of communicating, but to whom? My eyes traced the outline of the victim's hand, resting palm up beside him. The fingernails were clean, neatly trimmed. But as I leaned closer, my penlight beam focusing on the left hand, I saw it. A faint, almost invisible smudge of what looked like ink, lodged deep within the cuticle. Not the kind of ink I'd find in a pen. "Details," I answered, my mind racing. "The ink. It wasn't present on the other victims, or at least it hadn't been noted. Was this new, or had they simply missed it? The origamist was known for his meticulousness, his ability to erase his presence. But sometimes the smallest oversight could unravel everything. I pulled a small, sterile evidence bag from my kit, and with a pair of tweezers, carefully collected a scraping from the victim's cuticle. The detective watched me, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging curiosity. He clearly thought I was a relic, a ghost from a past he'd rather forget. But the origamist wasn't a ghost. He was horrifyingly real, and I was the only one who truly understood his language. As I sealed the bag, the fluorescent lights flickered again, longer this time. When they sputtered back to life, the detective was gone, no doubt to bark orders or chase down leads he deemed more conventional. The younger officer remained, his gaze fixed on me, a silent question in his eyes. "He's changing his methods," I responded, more to myself than to the officer. "Or, he's trying to tell us something new." The ink smudge, it was a deviation, a crack in the perfect facade. And in this sterile, unforgiving world of death, even the smallest crack could lead to the deepest truth. I felt a grim satisfaction. The game was on again. And this time I wouldn't let him win. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was thick enough to chew. It always was. A metallic tang, the ghosts of 1,000 past examinations, and something else. Something sharp and acrid that clung to the back of my throat. Detective Miller stood by the stainless steel slab, his shoulders hunched, the usual gruffness replaced by a weary resignation. "Another one, UserXG." I nodded, my gaze already scanning the scene. This victim, a man in his late 30s, lay exactly as the first had, pose immaculate, almost artistic. His arms were splayed, palms open like an offering. The only difference was the subtle shift in the tableau. The previous victim had been positioned on a worn Persian rug. This one lay on a sheet of stark white butcher paper, the edges precisely folded. It was a detail, small but significant, a deliberate variation. "Same Mo?" Miller asked, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like it," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. I moved closer, the sterile chill of the room seeping into my bones. The victim's skin was unnaturally pale, the kind of pallor that spoke of something beyond mere death. I knelt, my eyes tracing the contours of his body. No obvious signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, and then I saw it. On the right hand, just under the thumbnail, a faint, almost imperceptible smear. Not ink this time. It was a deep, bruised purple, like the residue from a crushed berry. My breath hitched. I'd seen that color before. Years ago, I stood, my movements stiff. "Did you find anything on the first victim that matched this?" I asked, gesturing to the purple smudge. Miller shook his head. "Just the ink, like you said, nothing else." Forensics went over him with a fine-tooth comb. He ran a hand over his tired face. "This killer is neat, too neat, too neat." That was an understatement. This was a performance, a carefully orchestrated repetition with minor, chilling alterations. It felt personal. It felt familiar. I pulled out the old case files, the ones I'd tried to bury for so long. The Nightingale murders, the label read in faded ink. My own handwriting, shaky and young. My fingers trembled as I opened the first folder. The crime scene photos were stark, black and white ghosts of a past I desperately wanted to forget. The victims, the meticulous staging, the signature element the press had latched onto, a single, perfect nightingale feather left at each scene. It had been dismissed as a bizarre flourish, a killer's ego, but I'd always felt there was more to it. I flipped through the reports, my eyes scanning the details. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Time of death, precise. The absence of any foreign DNA. And then I saw it tucked away in an appendix, a note from a junior technician. Observed faint discoloration under victim 2's left thumbnail. Not consistent with decomposition. Sample collected, but analysis inconclusive. My heart hammered against my ribs. Discoloration. Not ink, not berry. What was it? I remembered the victim, a young musician. He'd been found in his studio, surrounded by instruments. The note mentioned a collection of exotic plant samples found in his apartment, used for a botanical illustration project. Could that have been it? A residue from something he was working with? I pulled out the second Nightingale file. The victim, a retired botanist. And there in the detailed inventory of the crime scene was a small, almost overlooked item. A vial of crushed elderberries used for pigment. Elderberries, that deep, bruised purple. The ink on the first victim. He'd been a calligrapher. He'd been working on a commission, a historical document requiring a specific type of iron gall ink, made with oak galls and ferrous sulfate. The ink I'd used in my own early experiments. These weren't random alterations. They were echoes, deliberate, twisted homages to the Nightingale murders, but who and why now? I closed the Nightingale files, my hands slick with sweat. The patterns were too precise, the parallels too damning. It wasn't just a copycat. This felt like a conversation. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to prick the twilight sky. The old trauma, dormant for so long, was stirring. They were calling to me, and I had to answer. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker, was thick with the metallic tang of formaldehyde and something else. Something vaguely earthy, like damp soil. It was a smell that always clung to me after a long night, a phantom perfume of death. The single bare bulb above cast long, dancing shadows, making the stacked metal drawers look like rows of waiting coffins. A steady drip, drip, drip from a leaky pipe somewhere in the gloom was the only soundtrack to my unease. I ran a gloved finger over the discolored patch on the musician's forearm again. It wasn't uniform. There were faint, almost crystalline patterns within the bruise, like frost on a window pane. The preliminary report had called it an unidentified substance, but my gut screamed otherwise. It was too precise, too deliberate. The detective stood by the steel examination table, arms crossed, his expression a mask of professional skepticism. He'd been watching me for the last hour, his gaze sharp and unwavering. He'd initially dismissed my theories about the botanical illustrations, but the evidence, or rather, the lack of it where it should have been, had clearly pricked his curiosity. So, the detective finally said, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the oppressive silence, "You think this plant juice is our killer's calling card?" I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "Not juice," I corrected, my voice tight. "A complex alkaloid likely derived from a rare South American vine. The discoloration isn't a bruise, it's a localized tissue necrosis caused by a potent neurotoxin. It's designed to mimic a bruise, but the crystalline structure is key. It's a signature." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And how do you know all this about a rare South American vine, UserXG? You're not exactly on the force's approved list of consultants." The jab landed as intended. It was a constant reminder of why I was here, not in my own lab, but in this echoing, damp basement. "I have a particular set of interests," I said, choosing my words carefully. My past research, my obsession with obscure toxins and their effects, was what brought me here, and what would likely keep me here. The musician was an amateur botanist. He collected rare specimens. The killer knew this. They used his own tools against him in a way. He grunted, a non-committal sound. And the other victims, the architect, the librarian, what did they have in common with a musician and his exotic plants? I pushed a stray strand of hair behind my ear. This was the part that gnawed at me, the missing link. That's what we need to figure out. Individually, they seem disparate, but the staging of the crime scenes, the meticulous placement of objects, the specific angles of the bodies, it's all about control. And the cause of death, while different in each case, shares a common thread, a highly specific, difficult-to-trace poison, something that requires specialized knowledge and access. I pointed to the musician's hand, still resting on the table. "Look at his fingernails, clean, too clean. He wouldn't have been playing his instruments for long before. Well, before, but these are immaculate." I'd noticed it earlier, a detail so small it could be easily overlooked. In the chaos of a musician's studio, pristine fingernails felt wrong. The detective followed my gaze, his brow furrowed. He was processing, I could see it. The wheels were turning, even if he didn't want them to. "You're saying the killer cleaned his nails?" he finally asked, a hint of disbelief coloring his tone. "Or they were never dirty to begin with," I countered. "Consider the architect. He was found in his office, blueprints scattered, but his pens were all perfectly aligned. The librarian surrounded by books, but not a single page dog-eared or out of place. It's about presenting a facade, a narrative." My skin prickled. It felt like the killer was watching, playing a game of chess with us, each move calculated, each victim a pawn sacrificed for a larger, unseen strategy. "This isn't random," I stated, my voice firm. "The victims might seem unconnected, but the method, the artistry of the staging, it's the same, and that toxin. It's not something you pick up at the corner store. Someone with a very specific skill set is responsible. The detective walked to a small, grimy sink in the corner and splashed cold water on his face. He looked older, wearier under the harsh light. And you think you can find this person? It wasn't a question. I met his gaze, a flicker of the old fire igniting within me. I can try, I said, the words a quiet promise, but I can't do it alone. And I certainly can't do it if you dismiss every lead because it doesn't fit neatly into your established protocols. He dried his face with a paper towel, his movements deliberate. He looked at me, a long, appraising look that felt like he was peeling back layers, searching for the disgraced scientist beneath the determined investigator. "All right, UserXG," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "You've got my attention. Tell me everything else. Every single detail, no matter how small, and try to keep the jungle folklore to a minimum." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. It was a start. The game, it seemed, had truly begun. The chill in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker, wasn't just from the temperature. It clung to my skin, a damp, heavy blanket that mirrored the unease settling in my gut. The body on the stainless steel slab, the third one, lay under a thin sheet, but I'd seen enough. Each victim, meticulously arranged, felt like a taunt. The first, a financier, found posed in his opulent study. The second, an artist, sprawled amidst her unfinished canvases. And now this one, a retired librarian, tucked neatly into a display case at the City Museum, surrounded by ancient artifacts. I traced the faint outline of a small, almost invisible symbol etched onto the librarian's wrist. It was so subtle, I'd almost missed it, a tiny three-pronged star. I'd seen it before. On the first victim's cufflink, barely visible under the harsh glare of his study lamp. And on a chipped ceramic shard found near the artist's studio, a shard I'd initially dismissed as debris. My mind raced, piecing together fragments, a mosaic I was desperate to complete before it shattered. Anything UserXG. The detective's voice, gruff and impatient, sliced through the quiet. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the corridor, arms crossed. I didn't look up. "The symbol," I added, my voice low. "It's on all three." He grunted. "A calling card, what does it mean?" "I don't know yet." I turned back to the body, my gaze sweeping over the librarian's placid face. She looked so peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the violence of her end. The meticulous staging, the hidden symbol, this wasn't random. There was a pattern, a narrative being woven, and I was determined to decipher it. I'd spent the last 48 hours poring over their lives, their habits, their connections. The financier, a pillar of the financial district. The artist, a darling of the avant-garde scene. The librarian, a quiet scholar dedicated to preserving local history. On the surface, they were worlds apart. But I knew from my own past that killers who operated with such precision rarely chose their victims by chance. There had to be a thread, however thin, that bound them. My fingers brushed against the edge of the display case. The artifacts themselves were ancient pottery shards, faded tapestries, crumbling manuscripts. The librarian had been a curator, a guardian of these forgotten stories. As I examined the exhibit, my gaze fell on a small, tarnished silver locket nestled amongst the display. It was out of place, too modern, too personal. Against my better judgment, I reached out and gently lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy. Inside, two faded photographs. On one side, a young woman, her smile bright and hopeful. On the other, a man, his features obscured by time and wear. Something about the woman's eyes felt familiar. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, ran down my spine. This wasn't part of the exhibit, this was personal. "What's that?" the detective asked, his voice closer now. He'd moved silently, a skill honed over years of observation. "Just an anomaly," I replied, quickly closing the locket. "Something that doesn't belong." I slipped it into my pocket, a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep it hidden. Back at my workshop, the sterile scent of chemicals and the hum of the equipment were a welcome distraction. I laid out the photographs I'd taken of the symbol. Each one was identical, a perfect replica, but the librarian's wrist, It was fainter, almost a ghost of the mark on the cufflink and the shard. Was it older, or was it deliberately made less prominent? I pulled up the files on the financier and the artist. Their backgrounds were extensive, but nothing jumped out. Then, I remembered the librarian's specialization: local history, particularly the city's founding families. I'd brushed past it before, deeming it irrelevant to the current victims' lives. But now, with the locket and the symbol, it felt like a loose thread I needed to tug. I spent hours sifting through digital archives, dusty town records, and obscure genealogical websites. The financier, his family, had been instrumental in the city's early industrial growth. The artist's lineage traced back to a prominent architect who designed many of the city's historic buildings, and the librarian. Her family had been scholars, keepers of knowledge for generations. A pattern was emerging, subtle but undeniable. They were all connected not by their present lives but by their past, their ancestors. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing names, dates, and historical events. Then I found it, and next to his name, a peculiar insignia, a three-pronged star. A shiver traced its way up my spine. The symbol wasn't just a calling card, it was a family crest, a mark of lineage. This killer wasn't just targeting individuals, they were targeting descendants, but why? And how did the victims' current lives tie into this ancient legacy? My thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a sharp rap on my workshop door. It wasn't the rhythmic, official knock of the detective. This was urgent, almost frantic. My hand instinctively went to the drawer where I kept my personal defense tool. "UserXG, are I in there?" A voice called out, strained and urgent. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice I'd tried to forget. My breath hitched. This was more than just a professional threat, this was personal. The past, it seemed, wasn't content to stay buried. It had found me and it was coming for me. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping. Fluorescent flicker was thick with the metallic tang of formaldehyde and something else, something acrid and unsettling. Each drip from the overhead pipes echoed in the cavernous space, a relentless metronome counting down to what? I didn't have the luxury of time. My eyes traced the intricate, almost surgical precision of the librarian's wounds again. Not the frenzied rage of a spontaneous act, but the cold calculation of a craftsman. I knelt, my gloved fingers hovering inches above the faint, almost invisible etching on the victim's left wrist. It was a symbol, stylized and ancient, something I'd only seen in dusty texts on obscure cults. It matched the one I'd found at the previous scene, the one that had clawed its way back into my nightmares. This was him, or at least someone who knew him intimately. My colleague, the grizzled investigator, stood by the stainless steel table, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and a flicker of something I recognized as unease. He'd seen enough in his career to be jaded, but this was different. Anything UserXG. His voice was a low rumble cutting through the ambient noise. "It's the same symbol," I stated, my voice tight. "And the method, the meticulousness, it's all there." I stood, pacing the cold concrete floor, the scuff of my shoes unnaturally loud. And why the librarian? He was quiet, kept to herself. No enemies we can find. That was the rub, wasn't it? These victims on the surface were disconnected. A retired archivist, a librarian, a local historian. Their common thread wasn't obvious, but the killer clearly saw one. And that thread, I suspected, led back to something far more significant than a personal vendetta. I moved to the victim's small handbag, carefully laid out on a separate tray. Inside, a worn, leather-bound journal. I opened it, my gloved fingers turning the brittle pages. The librarian's neat, looping script filled the pages, detailing her daily routines, her thoughts on local flora, her quiet observations of the world. Then I found it. A series of entries dated a few weeks prior, growing increasingly agitated. She'd been researching something that had clearly frightened her. "He was onto something," I murmured, my gaze fixed on a passage describing hushed meetings, hushed tones, and hushed payments. He was documenting something, clandestine. I pointed to a name scrawled in the margin, almost an afterthought: Senator Albright's office. The investigator stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Senator Albright, the one pushing for that new development project downtown, the one with all the... Albright was a rising star, a man with immense influence. His project, a massive redevelopment of the old industrial district, had been fast-tracked, bypassing many of the usual environmental and historical reviews. I remembered reading about it in the papers, dismissing it as another politician's pet project. The archivist was researching the land's history. I answered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The historian was an expert on local heritage sites, and the librarian, they were obstacles. The investigator swore under his breath. So this killer, he's not just a psycho, he's a cleaner, tidying up loose ends for someone with deep pockets and powerful connections. The fluorescent lights above sputtered, casting the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker into a strobe-like effect, momentarily illuminating the grim reality of our situation. This wasn't just about catching a murderer anymore. This was about uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power. And the man I'd been hunting, the phantom from my past, was merely a tool, a highly effective, deadly tool in their service. I looked at the librarian's peaceful face, now a testament to a truth she'd uncovered. The symbol on her wrist wasn't just a signature. It was a warning that I, too, was now on their radar. The personal demons I'd been trying to outrun had just merged with a much larger, much more dangerous enemy. I felt a tremor run through me, not of fear, but of a grim, determined resolve. I had to see this through for them and for myself. The stale, metallic tang of the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was usually just a professional hazard. Tonight it felt like it was clinging to my skin, a second, unwelcome shroud. Detective Miller's hushed voice, usually a low rumble, was strained. UserXG, you need to see this. He gestured towards the examination table. The body, a man I'd only seen in grainy crime scene photos until now, lay still. The usual post-mortem pallor was there, but it was the details that made my gut clench. The precision of the wounds, the almost artistic arrangement of the victim's extremities, it was the signature. His signature. The one I'd spent years trying to forget. It's him, isn't it? Miller's question hung in the damp air. I swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. Yes, I managed, my voice raspy. It's him, or at least someone mimicking him perfectly. My mind raced, replaying old case files, the chilling certainty of the original perpetrator. This level of detail, this specific brand of theatricality. It wasn't a copycat, it was too intimate. Miller ran a hand over his tired face. The victim is a city councilman. He was found in his home office. No forced entry. Everything looked clean, almost too clean, until we found this. He pointed to the victim's left hand, which was splayed open. Nestled in the palm, resting on the pale skin, was a small, tarnished silver locket. The locket was old, intricately engraved with a pattern I recognized instantly. A swirling vine, a tiny, stylized raven. It was the same design I'd found etched onto the wooden handle of a murder weapon years ago, a weapon that had belonged to the man I'd put away, or so I'd thought. The third one. It was on the victim's bedside table. I logged it as evidence. It was never identified. It was just another piece of the puzzle we never fully solved. Miller's brow furrowed. So he's leaving you messages now, taunting you. Not just me, I said, my gaze drifting to the ceiling, the flickering lights momentarily blinding me. He's leaving them for the world. He's showing everyone he's still here, and he knows I'm watching. The implications settled like a suffocating weight. If he was back, and he was targeting people with this level of deliberate symbolism, it meant he was escalating. And the locket, it was a direct link to my past. A past I'd tried to bury under mountains of research and a self-imposed exile from active casework. Miller, when was this locket found at the previous scene? He checked his notes. Approximately 3 years ago, October 17th. My breath hitched. October 17th. That was the day my younger sister, Clara, had her birthday party. A party I'd missed because I was still working the original case, still convinced I had the killer cornered. Clara, she'd always been fascinated by old jewelry, by stories and symbols. She'd even had a locket like this, a family heirloom passed down from our grandmother. Is there any way to confirm this locket is the exact same one? I asked, my voice tight with a fear I hadn't felt in years. Miller looked at me, his expression softening slightly. I'll have forensics run a full analysis, but UserXG if it is. That's a pretty direct message. I didn't need him to say it. The message was screaming at me. He knew about Clara, he knew about my family. My past mistakes, the cases I'd mishandled, the lives I hadn't been able to save, they were all fair game now. This wasn't just about a killer and his victims anymore. This was personal. It was a twisted game of chess, and I'd just been checkmated. The conspiracy was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, a signature, and now it had a personal connection to me that threatened to unravel everything I'd worked to rebuild. My sister, the locket, the raven. It was all coming back, and this time it felt like it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything I held dear. I had to find him, not just for justice, but to protect the people I loved. The weight of that responsibility pressed down, heavier than any evidence I'd ever lifted. It always was. A cloying mix of disinfectant and something far less pleasant, a scent that clung to the back of my throat like a bad memory. My ally, a seasoned investigator with eyes that had seen too much and a weary set to his shoulders, ran a gloved hand over the cool, stainless steel surface of the autopsy table. He'd been quiet since we'd gotten the call, his usual gruff pronouncements replaced by a low hum of contemplation. "Anything?" I asked, my voice a little rough. The silence here amplified every small sound, the insistent drip, drip, drip from a leaky pipe overhead, the groan of the building settling. He shook his head, not looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the faint, almost invisible scuff marks near the drain. Nothing the lab boys missed, that's for sure. They're thorough, even if they are a bit too eager to chalk this up to whatever they're calling it this week. I leaned closer, my own eyes scanning the scene. The victim, a man who'd been found in a meticulously preserved state, almost too perfect, had been the third. Each one a macabre tableau, a twisted piece of art, and each one undeniably bearing the signature of the phantom from my past, the one I'd thought I'd buried along with my career. "He's playing with us, isn't he?" I murmured, more to myself than to my ally. "He wants us to see this, to know he's still out there, still capable." The word felt inadequate. Capable of what? Of orchestrating these elaborate deaths, of weaving a narrative of terror with human lives as his medium. My ally finally turned, his expression grim. Capable of making us look like fools, UserXG, and he's succeeding. He gestured to the victim's hands. "Look at this. No defensive wounds, none. He was either incapacitated or he knew his killer. And if he knew him, why wouldn't he have fought back?" I knelt, examining the victim's fingernails. Clean, almost unnaturally so. Or he trusted them implicitly, I said, my mind racing. This was the part that always got me. The intimate betrayals, the killers who moved within the circles of their victims, cloaked in familiarity. Trust doesn't usually end with this, my ally said, his voice tight. He pointed to a small, almost imperceptible discoloration on the victim's wrist, just above the watch line. Lab responded it was a mild irritant, nothing serious, but it's consistent across all three. I touched the spot gingerly, my gloved finger tracing the faint mark. An irritant, why? What purpose did it serve? It wasn't enough to incapacitate, not by itself, unless it was a prelude, a way to subtly weaken, to dull the senses before the final act. "He's leaving breadcrumbs," I said, standing up. "Not for the lab, for us, for me." My ally grunted. "Breadcrumbs that are leading us in circles. We've got the profile, we've got the modus operandi, but we don't have a name. He's using this to communicate, to provoke. Clara, my sister." He mentioned her. "He knows, he's been watching." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. My family, the one thing I tried so hard to shield from the wreckage of my past, was now the intended target of this monster. "Which means he's getting bolder," my ally stated, his voice low and dangerous. "And bolder means sloppier or more desperate." Desperate for what? I mused, pacing the length of the room. The metallic tang of the air seemed to intensify. He's achieved his artistic vision with these three. What's next? My ally stopped me, his hand firm on my arm. He's not just about the art, UserXG. He's about the message. And the message is for you. He's escalating. He wants you to feel the same helplessness he thinks you inflicted on others. Helplessness. The word echoed in the cavernous space. I knew that feeling. I'd lived with it for years, but this was different. The irritant, I said suddenly, a thought sparking. It's not just about weakening, it's about marking. A subtle way of identifying his targets, perhaps, or maybe a way to prepare them for something specific. My ally's brow furrowed. Prepare them for what? I shook my head, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening thud. He's not just killing them, he's harvesting something, or using them for a purpose beyond death. The thought was disturbing, but it fit the meticulous nature of his work, the almost ritualistic aspect of each scene. He wasn't just a killer, he was a craftsman, and these victims were his raw materials. My ally's jaw tightened. We need to find out who he's targeting next, and fast. He pulled out his phone. I'll have my team run a deep dive on the victim's associates. See if there's any overlap, anything we missed, anything that might point to a pattern beyond the superficial. As he spoke, my eyes fell on a small, almost invisible scratch on the victim's forearm, partially hidden by the sleeve of his shirt. It was too precise to be accidental, a fine, deliberate line. I'd seen that same precise scratch on the second victim, dismissed as a minor injury, but now seeing it again juxtaposed with the irritant mark. It felt like a signature, a hidden tag. The scratch. On the second victim, it was on the left forearm. This one, right. My ally looked at me, his expression questioning. It's not random, it's a sequence, and if he's following a sequence. My mind flashed back to an old case file, one that had been my undoing. A series of arsons, each one escalating in intensity. The pattern had been dismissed as coincidence, but I'd seen something more. A subtle, almost imperceptible progression. The victims, I breathed, my heart beginning to thrum with a dangerous energy. They're not just random, they're linked. He was setting the stage, and I had a terrible feeling I knew for whom. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and deeply unsettling. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, a second skin I couldn't shed. I ran a gloved finger along the cool, slick surface of the stainless steel examination table, the same one where I'd first seen the meticulous staging. This wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about unearthing a truth I'd buried deep within myself. The preliminary reports lay spread out before me, stark white against the gray metal. Each victim, a carefully chosen tableau of despair. The first, a librarian posed with an open book, pages stained with a single drop of crimson. The second, a retired musician, fingers curled as if reaching for silent keys, a delicate broken violin beside him. And the third, found just last night, a retired teacher, a chalk-dusted apple resting on his chest. It was the precision that gnawed at me. Not just the placement of the objects, but the subtle, almost invisible details. The way the light caught a particular strand of hair, the angle of a limb. It spoke of a mind obsessed with detail, a mind I knew too well. I looked up as the door creaked open, admitting the detective. He carried a worn manila folder, his expression grim. "Anything new, UserXG?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the oppressive silence. "The progression," I added, not looking at him. "It's not just about the victims, it's about the method. Each murder is a step further away from the initial act, a refinement." I tapped a finger on the report of the librarian. This was the introduction, the musician, the development, and the teacher. That was the crescendo. The detective approached the table, his eyes scanning the scattered papers. "I rest still stuck on that old case, aren't I? The one that got I kicked off the force." I bristled, a familiar wave of defensiveness washing over me. "It wasn't that old case," I corrected, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was the case, the one where I saw the pattern everyone else ignored. And this, I gestured around the cold, sterile room. "This is that pattern come back with a vengeance." He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Look, I appreciate my insights, but we need concrete evidence, not just hunches based on a ghost from my past." "He's not a ghost," I countered, my gaze fixed on a faint smudge near the edge of the table, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. It was a residue, barely there but familiar, like the faint scent of a specific brand of polish I'd encountered years ago. "He's real, and he's getting bolder." I picked up a photograph of the librarian, her eyes wide, frozen in a silent scream. The book beside her was a collection of classic detective novels, a morbid joke or a message. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I remembered the arsonist, how he'd left a single, charred playing card at each scene, a subtle signature. This killer, though, was far more sophisticated. Their signature was woven into the very fabric of the crime. "The apple," I murmured, picking up the photograph of the teacher. "Why an apple?" The detective shrugged. "School teacher seems obvious." "Too obvious," I replied, a knot tightening in my stomach. "This killer doesn't do obvious. They do symbolic, they do layered. The librarian with her books, the musician with his violin. These were their lives, twisted into their deaths. But the teacher, an apple is too simplistic, unless—" My eyes darted to the report on the musician, the violin case. I dismissed it as a prop, part of the staged scene, but now, looking closer at the high-resolution photograph, I saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible scratch on the polished wood near the clasp. It was too precise to be accidental, a specific scratch. I need to see the original evidence. The detective hesitated, then nodded. "It's in the evidence locker. I'll have them bring it up." While we waited, I revisited the librarian's file, the book, the Maltese Falcon. I'd skimmed it myself years ago. Sam Spade, a private investigator. What was the connection? My mind raced, sifting through fragmented memories, the dust motes dancing in the flickering fluorescent light, suddenly seeming like tiny pieces of a vast, unformed puzzle. When the evidence technician arrived with the violin case, I felt a prickle of anticipation. The case was old, its leather worn smooth with age. I ran my gloved finger over the scratch. It was deeper than I'd first thought, almost like a deliberate etching. And then, as I tilted the case under the harsh overhead light, I saw it. Etched into the wood, barely visible, was a tiny symbol, a stylized raven. My breath hitched. The raven. It was the symbol of the arsonist. The one I'd been dismissed for pursuing. The one who had vanished without a trace. But this wasn't a charred card. This was a permanent mark etched into the very instrument of the victim's life. The arsonist. I breathed, my voice trembling. He's back, but he's changed, or he's not working alone. The detective frowned, his eyes fixed on the symbol. A raven? I don't understand. He used to leave a raven's feather at the scenes, I explained, my mind racing, piecing together the fragments. I thought it was just a signature, but it was more than that. It was a marker, a way of saying, I was here and now. He's moved on to something far more personal, far more artistic. I looked at the victims again, the librarian, the musician, the teacher, their professions, their passions. This killer wasn't just choosing random people. They were choosing people who represented something. Knowledge, art, education. And then it hit me. The apple. It wasn't just about the teacher. It was about knowledge, the forbidden fruit. It's not just one killer, I answered, my voice gaining a desperate edge. It's a message, a statement, and the arsonist. He's not the mastermind, he's the instrument. Someone is using him, someone who knows my past. The metallic tang in the air suddenly felt suffocating. I had been so focused on the killer from my past, I'd missed the bigger picture. The true horror wasn't just the murders themselves, but the meticulous, calculated orchestration behind them. And the puppeteer, I suspected, was someone I never would have expected. Someone who had been watching me all along. The true horror wasn't just the meticulously arranged bodies, the theatricality of it all. It was the why, and the who behind the scenes pulling the strings. My gaze swept across the stark, tiled walls of the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker casting long, dancing shadows. A chill, independent of the room's ambient temperature, traced a path down my spine. The colleague, a seasoned professional with eyes that had seen too much, stood beside me, his expression grim. He'd been my anchor, my reluctant partner in this descent. I pointed to a barely perceptible smear on the stainless steel examination table, near where the latest victim had been found. It was almost invisible, a faint iridescent sheen that wouldn't register on a standard sweep. "There," I said, my voice tight. "Look closer." He leaned in, his brow furrowed. "Oil." "Not just any oil," I corrected, already reaching for my portable spectral analyzer. This was the part I excelled at, the part that separated me from the rest. The science, the undeniable truth etched in molecular signatures. The device hummed to life, its laser scanning the minuscule residue. The readout flickered, then stabilized. My breath hitched. "Polymer-based lubricant," I murmured, more to myself than to the colleague. "High grade, used in precision engineering, think robotics or advanced security systems." The colleague's eyes widened. "So our killer isn't just some artist with a scalpel. They've got access to industrial equipment. Or someone who deals in it," I countered, my mind racing. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta anymore. This was about a network, a calculated operation. The staged murders were a smokescreen, a distraction. The real objective was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. Suddenly, a sharp clang echoed from further down the corridor, followed by the scuff of heavy boots. My head snapped up. We weren't alone. "Too deliberate," I said, my senses on high alert. The dripping pipes, the flickering lights, they were all part of the atmosphere, but this was different. This was an intrusion. They know we're here. They know we're getting close. We moved as one, a silent understanding passing between us. I grabbed my equipment bag, the weight of it a familiar comfort, a tool of my trade. The colleague took the lead, his movements practiced and economical. Ozone, sharp and electric. We rounded a corner and froze. They weren't uniformed security. Their posture, the way they scanned their surroundings, spoke of a different kind of authority, threatening authority. "They're waiting for us." The colleague breathed, his voice barely audible. "This is a trap." My heart hammered, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was already calculating. Retreat wasn't an option. The only other exit was a service tunnel, a forgotten artery of the facility, usually sealed. But I'd mapped it in my head, a contingency I'd filed away for just such a desperate scenario. Now, we sprinted, the colleague a silent, powerful force beside me. The tactical figures reacted instantly, their shouts echoing behind us. A muffled thud, then the sharp crack of a projectile ricocheting off the tiled wall near my head. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. My flashlight beam cut a shaky path, revealing a claustrophobic space of rough-hewn concrete and exposed conduits. The dripping pipes from the morgue seemed to follow us, their rhythmic plinks now a maddening counterpoint to our frantic escape. "They're coming," the colleague yelled, his voice strained. I fumbled with the lock on a heavy steel door at the end of the tunnel, my fingers slick with sweat. The spectral analyzer, still in my bag, felt like an anchor, a reminder of what we were fighting for, what we had discovered. The advanced lubricant, the precision engineering. This wasn't just a killer, this was a conspiracy. The lock clicked open. We burst out into a cavernous, dimly lit space, an abandoned warehouse, the air heavy with the scent of old oil and dust. Moonlight streamed through grimy, broken windows, illuminating stacks of decaying crates and skeletal machinery. "Where are we going?" The colleague panted, scanning the vast, empty space. "The lubricant," I said, my mind piecing it together with a terrifying clarity. "It's not just for the killer's tools, it's for their escape, their transport. They're using something advanced, something that requires that specific grade of lubricant." My flashlight beam swept across the floor, catching a faint, greasy sheen leading towards a massive, half-open loading bay door. It was subtle, easily missed, but I saw it, the same iridescent smear. "There," I breathed, pointing. "They're not just escaping, they're moving something." I could feel his tension, his readiness. We were a unit forged in the crucible of this investigation. As we neared the loading bay, a low hum vibrated through the floor. It grew steadily louder, a mechanical thrum that sent a shiver through me. sleek, metallic, unlike anything I'd ever seen on the road. It moved with an unnatural grace, its surface gleaming, and as it glided forward, I saw it. A faint trail of iridescent lubricant glistening on the concrete, marking its path. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than I could have imagined. This was no ordinary chase. This was a desperate race against a future I hadn't anticipated, powered by a technology I barely understood, orchestrated by a ghost from my past. And I was caught in the middle of it, the only one who could see the truth. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker, was thick with the metallic tang of decay, a scent I knew all too well, yet one that still managed to claw at my throat. Each drip from the ancient pipes overhead echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space, a relentless countdown. My colleague moved beside me, a silent shadow, his senses on high alert. We were deeper than we'd ever been, the concrete walls pressing in, the low hum of overworked machinery a constant, unnerving thrum. I'd felt it the moment we descended the grimy stairs, a chilling familiarity that tightened my gut. This wasn't just another crime scene. It was a stage set for a ghost from my past. The killer had left a trail, each victim a macabre echo of the ones from years ago, the ones that had broken me. And now, here we were, at the supposed epicenter. My colleague signaled, his hand a tight fist against his chest. I nodded, my own grip tightening on the portable UV light. This place was a tomb, and I had a terrifying suspicion I knew who the architect of this morbid gallery was. We moved with practiced caution, our boots crunching softly on what I prayed was just dust and debris. The smell intensified as we rounded a corner, the scent of antiseptic failing to mask the underlying rot. And then I saw it. Not a body, not yet, but a tableau. A single pristine white orchid placed with surgical precision on a dissection tray. The signature, the orchid, it was always the orchid. A symbol of purity, a stark contrast to the filth and violence that had been committed. It was a taunt, a declaration. "They're here," I finally managed, my voice raspy. I swept the UV light across the far wall, the beam illuminating faint, almost invisible traces. Not blood, not exactly. Something else. A fine, iridescent powder. I'd seen it before in the lab under magnification. It was a specific type of fungal spore, one that only grew in extremely controlled, sterile environments. Environments that required a certain expertise. My colleague moved ahead, his weapon leading the way. We reached a large, industrial freezer unit, its thick metal door slightly ajar. This was it, the heart of the operation. I pushed the door open further, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the shelves were meticulously organized, not with body parts but with vials and petri dishes, each labeled with an unnerving neatness. And in the center of the room, illuminated by a single bare bulb that seemed to defy the general gloom, stood a figure. They were dressed in clean, sterile lab attire, a stark contrast to the decay surrounding them. The hood obscured their face, but I knew. The posture, the deliberate way they held themselves, the absolute stillness. It was the same stillness I'd seen in the crime scene photos, the same unnerving calm. "Hello, UserXG," a voice said, distorted by the hood, yet undeniably familiar. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that had haunted my nightmares. I knew I'd find my way here. My colleague raised his weapon, his finger steady on the trigger. "Freeze! Drop my weapon!" The figure didn't move. They turned their head slowly, as if observing us for the first time. The hood shifted, and for a fleeting second I saw a glint of eyes behind the sterile mask, to the sterile equipment laid out on a nearby counter. My work is far more precise. I stepped forward, my own hands empty, my focus entirely on the figure. "I think this is precise. This is destruction." "A necessary purification," the figure countered, their voice unwavering. "The world is rife with imperfection. UserXG, I merely corrected. And I, my former colleague, I understand the beauty of precision, don't I? I understand the elegance of a perfect solution." My colleague shifted, his weapon wavering slightly. He didn't understand. He couldn't. This wasn't about brute force or simple violence. It was about obsession, about a twisted sense of order. I was never precise, I responded, my gaze locked on the figure. I was always reckless. I always cut corners. I always left traces like that spore. I thought I was so clever hiding it in the ventilation system, but I forgot about humidity. I forgot about condensation. I forgot about the fundamental principles of microbial growth. The figure tilted their head. A flicker of something crossed their obscured face. Annoyance. Surprise. The orchid. I pressed on, my mind working furiously, conjuring every detail I'd ever learned about their methods. I used it to signify purity, didn't I? But it's also a symbol of resilience, of survival, and it needs specific conditions to thrive. Conditions I tried to replicate but always got wrong. Too much light, not enough water, the wrong kind of soil. The figure took a step back, their stillness finally broken, their voice losing some of its composure. My methods are flawless. They were never flawless, I countered, taking another step forward. They were just effective enough for I to get away with it for a while, until I got sloppy, until I started leaving my little calling cards, thinking no one would ever connect the dots, but I did. I always did. My colleague remained frozen, his weapon trained, but I could see his confusion. He was looking to me, waiting for my lead. This was my fight, my past, my responsibility. This isn't about purification, I added, my voice low and steady. This is about my ego, about my need to prove myself, to prove that I was better than everyone else, better than me. The figure finally shed the hood. The face beneath was gaunt, etched with a desperate, almost feverish intensity. It was a face I recognized, a face I had once trusted. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a devastating confirmation of my deepest fears. I always wanted to be the one in control, a mixture of rage and despair. They lunged, not at me, but at the control panel for the freezer. My colleague reacted instantly, shouting a warning, but it was too late. The figure slammed their hand down on a large, red button. A deafening hiss filled the air as the temperature inside the freezer plummeted. I knew what they had done. They hadn't planned to escape. They had planned to destroy everything, to take it all down with them. The hiss was the last thing I remembered before the world went white. Not a gentle, peaceful white, but a sharp, blinding flash that stole my breath. When my vision swam back into focus, the air was thick with a cloying, metallic scent. It was the smell of fear, I realized, and something else, something cold and sterile. I was lying on the grimy floor of the basement morgue, pipes dripping rhythmically somewhere in the dim light. The fluorescent tubes above flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stainless steel tables look like monstrous beasts. My colleague, bless their quick reflexes, was already on their feet, a grim set to their jaw. The one who had unleashed this chaos was gone, vanished, like smoke. "Are you all right, UserXG?" My colleague's voice was rough, strained. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting, disoriented. Disoriented was an understatement. The icy blast that had erupted from the freezer unit was meant to incapacitate, to freeze us in our tracks, literally. There had been something else in the air, something that made my lungs burn and my vision blur. The figure had managed to escape. The control panel, so carelessly slammed, was now a mess of sparking wires and melted plastic. I scanned the room, my forensic instincts kicking in despite the lingering disorientation. Nothing. No dropped weapon, no scuff marks that weren't already there from countless previous investigations. My colleague was already on the radio, their voice a low, urgent murmur as they relayed the situation to the authorities. I, however, was drawn back to the freezer unit. It was still emitting a faint mist, a ghostly exhalation into the stale air. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning every inch. Then I saw it. It wasn't standard equipment. It looked modified. "Here," I said, my voice gaining a little strength as I pointed. "Look at this." My colleague joined me, their brow furrowed. They picked up the cylinder, turning it over in their gloved hands. "What is it?" "I don't know for sure," I admitted, "but it doesn't belong here, and the gas, the way it affected us. This was it, the culmination of their elaborate plan. The ensuing hours were a blur of activity. Forensics teams swarmed the basement morgue, the sterile white of their suits a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. The cylinder was carefully bagged and tagged, destined for analysis. My colleague and I gave our statements, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a profound weariness. Later, back in the quiet of my own space, the case files spread out before me, I finally had a moment to breathe. The conspiracy, as extensive and insidious as it was, had been dismantled. The individuals behind it, those who had sought to manipulate and control, were being brought to justice. The staged murders, the elaborate cover-ups, the attempts to frame innocent people, it had all unraveled. But the true resolution wasn't just about catching the culprits. It was about me. For so long, I had been defined by my past failures, by the ghost of the killer I had failed to stop years ago. This case had forced me to confront that ghost, not by replicating the past, but by learning from it. I had trusted my instincts, I had collaborated, and I had refused to let fear paralyze me. The killer from my past, and the people behind this current operation, they were cut from the same cloth, but their methods were more sophisticated, more far-reaching. They had used technology, influence, and fear to achieve their goals. I looked at the photograph of the original killer, the one that had haunted my nightmares for years. The world outside my window was waking up to a new day. The city, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded beneath its surface, was stirring. I knew I couldn't go back to how things were before. The life I had, the one spent in isolation, wrestling with my demons, was no longer sustainable. This case, this harrowing journey, had shown me that there was still a place for me, for my skills, for my unique perspective. Perhaps I wouldn't be working in a sterile lab analyzing blood spatters. Perhaps my path would be different, less conventional. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer a prisoner of my past. The basement morgue, with its dripping pipes and flickering fluorescent lights, had been the stage for a final confrontation, not just with a killer, but with myself. And in the quiet aftermath, I had finally found my resolution.